Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of No Earthly Explanation with your host, Donald Schmidt, and myself, Brittany Barbieri. Tonight, we have quite an amazing guest, someone that has been an idol in this community for myself for a very long time, someone that I consider a very dear friend. And Don, I know, don't get upset, but he does hold a trophy to me in a category that of research that I love.
I'm sure it's rightly so.
But before we get started, before we get into it, Don, it's been a little bit since we spoke last. So what's new with you? Anything of interest or topic in the UFO community that we should be brought up to speed on?
With the 75th anniversary of Roswell, which is dominating most of my media appearances, and then the fact that we decided at the beginning of the year that we were going to commemorate for the entire year, not just over the 4th of July weekend, which is typically when we do celebrate the event. And so there's a buzz that still continues because of the congressional hearing in Washington, and the fact that now the onus is on Congress to see what they will do next. And as we continue to push that they actually would allow whistleblowers, that they would grant immunity to potential, specifically military sources, pilots, strategic air command officers, radar operators, an opportunity to testify without fear of any form of government reprisal. And we are reaching out to certain representatives that were part of that committee, and we're offering them whatever assistance, whatever information we can provide to educate them further as far as what they should be looking at and what questions they should be posing. And we just hope that the situation continues. I'm not going to hold my breath because Congress has had a long history of dangling the carrot, and then due to their own ignorance, their own naivety, and the fact that the 24-hour news cycle has already passed, that they move on to the next scandal, so to speak. But we will be diligent and continue to push them in the right direction.
Well, that's good. I have to say real quick, I am happy to hear that they are finally giving immunity to those that need to come forward and discuss, because I know that a lot of them didn't want to come forward because of the repercussions that they would have to endure. So it's kind of nice that they're now getting kind of almost grandfathered in to be like, it's okay, you can tell the truth and come out and tell your story, which is nice.
Oh, you have to be careful that strings normally are very often attached. And there's a specific espionage clause that Congress can exercise where they can grant individuals possessing classified information such immunity. And they simply have to exercise the very power that they have.
Yep, that's true. Well, it sounds like we have our hands full on the UFO community side. And now
if I could just put a plug before you switch gears, because on the way home today I heard an announcement that surprised me a little bit. NASA just announced today that they are constituting a committee specifically to investigate. So for whatever, whether they have any greater independence, being a quote civilian, civilian organization.
It's not the first time that when Jimmy Carter was president, in an attempt to fulfill one of his campaign promises, and he was the president who declassified the Project Blue Book files, which were the last official investigation by the Air Force. So in '77, Blue Book was declassified, but Carter tossed it to NASA at that time. Now, he didn't make it an executive order as he should have, but he asked NASA to investigate, and they quickly brushed it aside. So I responded with my own statement today that if the last 50 years have demonstrated NASA's ability to continue their own mandate, as far as I'm not going to hold my breath for longer than 10 years because I don't expect much more regarding the whole subject. But who knows? Let's hope they surprise us all.
Yeah. If they do, I'm going to start brushing off my resume. Time to employ that position. So now we're going to switch gears. And before I do, I have to say this because for me, this is a big moment for myself to have two mentors of mine in one area at the same time. It's kind of like a brain explosion for me. So it's amazing for me to be sitting here talking to two people that growing up and watching and learning and reading their books and seeing them on TV are now two of my closest and dearest friends. So much respect to you both. And as we shift over into a different field of research, we welcome to the show Professor Jeffrey Meldrum, who we adore and we love through the fieldwork of Sasquatch in the community. So, Jeff, I hand it to you.
Oh, well, thank you very much for inviting me and including me in the conversation. I'm sure it'll be a scintillating exchange of ideas. So I'm looking forward to it.
And I'm as well.
So who wants to start with the first zinger, Don? Do you want to, or do me? Which one?
Well, if I may, one of the things that attracted anyone and everybody to the very topic was the Patterson-Gilman film, correct?
Right.
And I remember when Roger Patterson was making the rounds at that time, and I was a young boy, and I was just captivated by the possibility that they actually had something on film, something that defied conventional explanation, something that was not someone in a form of gorilla suit or anything else. And here we are. Now it's 50 years later, correct? And it has stood the test of time that even with the level of sophisticated technology and the manner by which we're able to go back and retest and re-examine over and over again, it still stands as the best film we have, correct?
In my opinion, absolutely. You're right. It's interesting how there's almost a history of repeated assaults by the skeptics with some supposed revelation or something that motivates those who are more inclined to lend credibility to this to re-examine it and re-examine it with the technology that has come into existence since the last re-examination, and whether it's enhanced stabilization, whether it's color channel splitting, whether it's now smart computer or computer imaging techniques. I went blank on the term. I worked just recently with a student up in the Seattle area by the name of Isaac Tien. Computer vision, there's the term.
Yes.
And so he was able to even tease out more satisfying images that allowed us to, no real aha moments, no real revolutionary revelations, but yet it allowed us to demonstrate the things that we could infer, we as experts of anatomy and kinematics and function and so forth, that we could infer from the film, but demonstrate to the lay audience in a much more compelling way. I mean, I had to laugh. One of the show's resident skeptics who offer a skeptical interpretation of some of the evidence that is dealt with in that show, when he viewed the improved version of the film that Isaac had produced using his various techniques, he got back to the producer. The producer felt the need to phone me up and share that with me, but he said, "Hey, you're making it hard for me to remain skeptical." He was so impressed. He had never seen the film presented in such an impactful way, and it leaves an impression. I'm like you. I was about 11 years old, sitting in the Spokane Coliseum watching this projected onto the silver screen, and wow, what an impression! So to see it on a big screen,
no less, on a big screen, right?
Oh yeah. So it was larger than life, and even at that age, I was already very steeped in natural history. I was a budding naturalist and collector of all things that I came across in the out of doors, and was fascinated by primates. I wanted to study primates and human evolution even then. So, so it wasn't like it was just. I mean, I was impressed. I mean, it just struck me as so spontaneous and so natural. I mean, it never looked like a man in a fursuit to me. And I'm always, I'm always a bit bemused by people who just brush it off with that rather cavalier pronouncement, and usually they don't have the wherewithal to evaluate it. So they're not only perhaps biased, but unqualified to evaluate it objectively.
Well, for the listeners who, first of all, may not even know what we're talking about, why don't you just give a quick account of what led to what we both agreed is the best footage of a Yeti ever.
We three.
Yeah, all three of us.
All three of us agree, hands down.
Well, Brit, sure. Sorry.
Well, as a thumbnail, Roger was fascinated by this topic. He was deeply impressed, as so many of us also eventually were, by the writings of Ivan Sanderson.
Yes.
And Sanderson was also a popular writer, so some of his treatments of these topics showed up in popular men's magazines like True. I think he was a regular contributor to True,
Saga,
RBC, and Saga. Yeah, the magazines that we youngsters would sneak in and try to thumb through real quick to see if there was anything about Bigfoot or flying saucers.
Because they could have
he was so good.
Bikinis once in a while. Yeah.
Exactly. So it's kind of contraband there. But anyway, Patterson was impressed, and so fascinated by the prospect that there could actually be these things out there. And he, being kind of a jack of all trades and clever guy, always coming up with these patents. And apparently he had a licensing attorney down in California that he went down to visit. So he would pass through Bigfoot country there in Northern California on his way down from Yakima, and there was a flurry of stories at that time. He became friends with Al Hodgson, who ran the sort of mercantile, the general store there in Willow Creek, and had an understanding with Al that if anything came to the fore, to please let him know. Mm-hmm. Well, at one point, there was a long line of footprints discovered on the Blue Creek Mountain roadway, and Al was obliged to first contact John Green, who brought Bob Titmus down. Actually, Renee DeHinden. Titmus came down later. So John Green and Renee DeHinden went down, and probably the most studied and documented trackway ever was also examined by a PhD archaeologist from the University of British Columbia. And then eventually, when they had finished their investigation, Al called Bob. Bob twisted, called Roger. Roger twisted Bob's arm. Bob had the horses and the trailer to get them down there. And so they went down, and after weeks, by the time they got there, by the time Bob was able to get his affairs in order, he was a construction contractor at the time. So he had to make sure, I guess, his crews had enough work and so forth, and lined up for them. And they went on down, but the rains had pretty much washed out most of the most visible tracks, which were largely in the very fine dust of the logging roads there. And they saw a few things, but not much. But they spent days and days running the roads, driving the roads at night after the logging trucks were gone, riding up and down the creek bottoms looking for evidence. And so after about 2 weeks, they decided to go up this particular creek, up Bluff Creek Canyon, and that's where it happened. Suddenly the horses caught scent of something as they rounded a big crow's nest, a big a jumble of debris left by the seasonal flood that had scoured out that section of the canyon, and had obscured their approach, and also the scent of the creature. The horses suddenly saw it and reared and
reacted. The horse reared, yes.
Reacted fearfully, yeah. Roger's horse fell over. The pack horse pulled away and bolted, and Roger managed to grab his camera and run across the creek, shouting back to Bob, "Cover me!" And so Bob rode across the creek, dismounted, pulled his 30-06 out of the scabbard, held on. He said he held on to the reins for dear life. He had a more seasoned horse, but still he didn't want to be left there on foot as he watched this thing retreating, this gigantic figure retreating rapidly, very rapidly. I think it picked up pace. When they first encountered it, it was literally just across the creek. So it was probably only about 40 feet away. They got a very good view of it. And then all heck broke loose as the horses bolted and everything. But then it started striding away, but rather casually, it seemed.
Right.
But once Bob rode the horse across the creek and dismounted, Bob always said he wasn't sure. Roger went running across the creek with his camera held up to his eye, and the creek had cut down about a 3-foot channel in the rather expansive sandbar. And with not much sense of peripheral vision, Roger literally ran into that 3-foot sandbar, and that knocked him to his knees. And right at that same point was when Bob was dismounting. So Bob wasn't quite sure whether it was Roger falling or him dismounting. I think it was him dismounting. That's right when you get that classic scene where it looks back over the shoulder. Yeah. Right. Because it's when you get off your horse, and I've talked to so many people who not that many. I mean, I could count them on one hand, but I've talked to other witnesses who got very close to a Sasquatch because they were on horseback. And then at the last second, like this, the one was describing they're on a very familiar trail where she often rode her horse, came out of the trees, and there was a bit of a clearing, and she goes, "Where did that rock come from, that boulder?" And as she got within about 10 feet of it, the boulder stood up, turned and looked at her, and walked away into the trees.
Right.
And anyone who's gone to a winter feeding of an elk herd, you can ride out on horseback or go out in the wagon and be right there, arm's length from the elk. But as soon as you separate yourself from the animal or the structure,
that's so true,
then you're different, and the elk will give you a wide berth. So I think that was one of the
advantage, or at least
one of the factors in
pretext
this,
in setting this up, that you're on horseback, right?
Yeah.
And as you describe it, how could that possibly have been scripted? That you have a series of circumstances, and then what causes it to actually turn?
Right.
I mean, again, how could that possibly have been staged?
Well, and I was, that was one of the questions I asked Lyle Laverty. Lyle, who eventually became number 2 in the U.S. Forest Service and then retired and then moved back to Colorado. But he was on site with his summer crew, salvage marking the timber that had been brought down by this flood. They were going to go in and harvest these logs before they got old and split, dried out and split and so forth. So he was right there, and he heard the commotion about what Roger had done in Willow Creek, where they were staying over for the weekend, out of the field. And he goes, when he heard the description, he said, "Well, we're camped right close to that." And so they went right to the spot, and he snapped off several pictures of the footprints. Well, I eventually had the chance to speak with Lyle on the phone, and my first question was, "Lyle, tell me, just what did you see? I mean, what was your impression of the of the scene of the crime, so to speak, the crime scene. And he said, well, it was just what they described. He said there was this obvious line of deeply impressed footprints. And he said, I took several pictures of them. And he said there were horse hoof prints, shod horse hoof prints, and cowboy boot prints. He said clearly there had been a lot of activity of some sort, because there were tracks all over the place, and traces of the plaster where Roger had cast the right and left. And I said, well, was there anything though amongst that gave you the suggestion that just as you said, there was a rehearsal, or this was scripted in some way? And he said, no, it just appeared. I mean, it was one pass of heavy footprints. So it seemed to be just a spontaneous encounter. And then a lot of activity, just as Roger had described, them, jumping off the log to see how deeply they could imprint, and walking the horse alongside to see how deep the horse hoof prints sank into the sand, etc. So he was
it's the granddaddy. It's the granddaddy of all these particular incidents, in that it is, as I said, stood the test of time, and the fact that both of us, all three of us, we have no problem in dealing with skeptics. We all need to have healthy skepticism. It's what protects us from falling, as far as to, charlatans and people who are actors, who are setting us up for a fall, so to speak. It's when we're dealing with debunkers, when we're dealing with scoffers, that no matter what the evidence, no matter what they are provided, it's don't bother me with the facts. I have my mind made up.
Sure.
And then the fact that they continue to engage us, which is interesting. If they feel so confident that they've won the day, why are they still always stalking us as to make sure that they're able to spin and manipulate, an incident to satisfy as far as their agenda? So it's we need not even paying attention to them any longer. They provide nothing.
Oh, that's right. I agree. I mean, I enjoy engaging in a skeptical conversation occasionally, because it keeps me sharp. It keeps me thinking about things that I might have taken for granted or have looked at so many times. But you're absolutely right. I just am baffled when I do visit one side or the other. The coalition is one that continually pops up on my feed. But it's like some of these guys haunt that thing on a daily basis, and I'm thinking, if you're so convinced, if you think this is so stupid and so inane, why would you spend so much of each and every one of your waking days? It just
because
I can offer some explanations why.
Do you think they do you think that they sit there and try to find one inkling that they can say, there it is? Because I know they've tried that with the whole zipper, and the back looks like it has a zipper up it or whatever, and that up the back of the primate. And it's I even sent you a video. I was watching gorillas, and I said, if you watch as the female was walking away, the way the muscle structure is, it looked like I could say there's a zipper up her back, So I was I'm they're looking for something constantly, and they can't find it. And I think it irritates them. I think it really irritates them.
It's fundamentally for me, the question is simply what motivates them. Why are they so concerned? And I think it's just most of the characters that are the most vocal is just it's more personality issues than it is intellectual, honestly. But in any case, but much more interesting. And this is the thing. I mean, it doesn't just boil down to anymore this idea of what can and can't exist. Because that's kind of out the window. Anyone who says they can't exist, therefore they don't exist, is just simply, quite frankly, ignorant. They don't know what the current science is, which accommodates something like this very, very readily now. And so it's no longer a question of possibility. It boils down entirely to probability. I mean, it's very possible. And that's one thing about the film. The approach I take in discussing and presenting the film now is a retrospective. How in the world could they possibly have come up with this, which in so many ways cut right against the grain of conventional wisdom in anthropology in the 60s and 70s, and yet now, 50 years later, and even earlier, over the past several decades of the past half century, much of our thinking has turned 180 as to the nature and the pattern, the process of hominin evolution, to the point where there are point after point after point that actually anticipated by decades what we currently understand. You know, one of my favorites, and at the risk of repetition, but it's such a dramatic illustration of this, John Napier, who was on the panel at the Smithsonian, he was one of the more sympathetic voices, even though, I mean, and so intrigued by the prospect that he was motivated to write a book, you know, in his golden years, approaching retirement, that he spent about 4 or 5 years writing this book about Bigfoot and Yeti. And when it came to the film, he gave it a thumbs down. And but he acknowledged that he really couldn't put his finger on anything except that when he looked at that figure from the waist up, it looked so ape-like, like a gorilla, but from the waist down, it had these long, disproportionate legs for a gorilla that was more like a hominid, he would say in that time. And he said it was just inconceivable that such a mosaic, such a hybrid of adaptation would exist in one body. So it had to be faked. Well, sure. I mean, his book came out in, I think, 72 or 73, shortly thereafter, the announcement of Lucy, Australopithecus afarensis, was made. And for the first time, we had, you know, undisputed association between cranial and postcranial, much more complete and undeformed or distorted pelvis and knees and so forth, that clearly showed the bipedal adaptation. And in the popular press, how did they describe it? The scientists said, well, from the waist up, it looks essentially like a chimpanzee, but from the waist down, it looks like a human. Yeah. That's exactly the combination of traits that was used to condemn the film just a half a decade earlier. What if Napier had delayed writing his book for another 5 to 10 years? I mean, would he been whistling a completely different tune? I mean, that's just fascinating to me.
Would his opinion been swayed? Yeah.
Yeah, and there's example after example after example of things. I was just discussing, and so many comments were made that just revealed that the anthropology at that stage was still kind of young, and a lot of the experts were not as expert as by today's standards. As one was that I was just dealing with someone that emailed me with an insightful question, had to do with the relative brain size and the birth canal. This person is actually an OBGYN. And so I shared with him, you know, one of the criticisms by one of the Smithsonian people was, well, look at this, they said. It's obviously portrayed or constructed, the hoax is constructed to portray a female for whatever reason with these pendulous breasts, but it walks like a man. Ergo, it is simply a man in a fursuit. Well, why would a female primate walk like a man? Well, because it doesn't have a large brain that requires the expansion of the pelvis, the broadening of the hips and enlargement of the birth canal to accommodate that hominin brain, relative brain size. Instead, it has a brain that's, you know, on par with other great apes, essentially. And so it walks like a male biped, you know, that's the default. The female, the human female is the departure from the default position. And so again, it just confirms the what would be what looks like a contradiction is actually a confirmation.
Confirmation.
The credibility.
Isn't it true too that anthropologists have suggested the cranial ridge as far as on the creature?
Yes.
Also,
and that there's some room for discussion there. I mean, well, one of the criticisms that was made is it was interpreted as having a sagittal crest. Well, you really can't tell that. I mean, you can tell that the cranium is higher, more further back than at the brow. I mean, there's a pretty steep slope, or a pretty shallow slope. Excuse me, a shallow slope going up. Whether that's a bony prominence, because remember that the bony fin, the crest, is completely encompassed by muscle. So the cranium, that surface area, the reason for the fin or the crest is to provide greater surface area for the very large temporalis muscles, the muscles up on the side of our head, and theirs as well. But I mean, ours is limited to just about the size of your palm there.
But what hoaxers would even think of that?
Well, sure. No, that kind of anatomy, knowledge of that kind of anatomy was not common. This was way before the days of Jane Goodall and Diane Fossey bringing these great apes into our living rooms, and of course the heyday of paleoanthropology and all the discussions of human evolution and the discovery of fossil hominins, which was really, the golden era was started in the 70s. And if you want to call it that, I mean, it's just completely, it's getting ridiculous now how many hominins that keep getting discovered, added to the bushy tree. But that itself is significant because we now understand that the pattern of hominin evolution is a tremendous amount of diversity. There were lots of ways to be a hominin and make a living across the landscape. And we know that many of those lineages we now know have persisted alongside our own for many, much till much more recent times than would have been acknowledged just 20, 30 years ago. I mean, so this comes back to the question of possibility. There is a scientific context for the existence of relic hominoids, bipedal hominoids. And it's, in the face of so much evidence that suggests, short of conclusive evidence, but suggestive evidence, with that backdrop, why would you dismiss it offhandedly and be so?
Yeah, exactly.
And cite 50-year-old pronouncements by non-experts, really.
And yet science, the part of science that does accept the very possibility, they would not concede that we're dealing with the missing link, so to speak.
Well,
and if you were going to stage a situation for whatever, benefit of science, why wouldn't you create the missing link? Why wouldn't you try to establish as far as that connection to as far as the primitive?
Well, sure.
I've had that debate before. Yeah. I mean, that's a
Well, you're right. And this was some of the motivation for the search for the Yeti was still kind of couched in that sort of mentality, that these were subhumans that were somehow possibly ancestral to our own species. And now today, our understanding of like I said, the pattern, the process of hominin evolution is very different. We would see these not as missing links so much as, because we don't see nature as a chain, a single file march, and we're trying to fill in the linkages between these major species, but rather this bushy tree that has lots of parallel branches, And so rather than view them as missing links, somehow, I mean, there are some, I shouldn't make blanket statements, because when we're talking about Sasquatch, we could very well be talking about something that's a cousin of an orangutan or a gorilla. I mean, it's a large bipedal ape, or a very early hominin offshoot, in which case it would be a closer cousin to us than to the other great apes, but a distant one like we were talking before the show, that has a total lack of material culture that predates the emergence of our own genus, Homo. But there are other forms now, which I'm more comfortable talking about than I was back when I first launched down this path. It's one thing to be labeled the Bigfoot guy, but to be labeled the Bigfoot, Yeti, Almasti, Orang Pendek guy, that gets to whoa, what? Meldrum's gone off the deep end completely. But now, actually, here's the irony of that, though. Now the suggestion of those other forms actually lends more credibility. Yeah. They're sort of self-reinforcing, because it fleshes out this picture of a bushy tree with multiple parallel lineages. So a relic Neanderthal population in the very place where you would expect to find the descendants of Neanderthals in their former range, or the Almasti or not the Almasti, the Orang Pendek in Southeast Asia, and all the other names that go with it. But in Southeast Asia, a relic Australopithecine, perhaps, that may have had a wider distribution outside of Africa, and now the relic are holed up in the most extreme, out of the way place, the same place where Homo erectus managed to hang on until perhaps as recently as 25,000 years ago, and so it's so sensible, so rational, that if people can get past the tabloid, can get past the unfortunate legacy of the 70s. I think there's a lot of things in the 70s we'd all like to forget, right?
I've often said that's one decade I'd like to forget.
Oh my God.
It wasn't that bad. I graduated in 76, so there were some good times back then. But
but it's true though, because even media has blown Sasquatch way out of proportion to where, for people to look at it like what you're saying, in the words that you put it, makes people, I think, take a step back and look at it a little differently. But the way the media produces it, it's like this ridiculous monster, and it's coming from a different, universe than ours, or it was dropped off by aliens or whatever, all these crazy things. It just puts into people's head that it's nothing more than this fantasy novel. It's not real. Nothing like this exists. But it's a heavy debate, because throughout history, there was always through science of it's not possible. And then it's like, oh, wait, they discovered it. It's real. And it's like, that's how we have these animals today. The pandas, the lowland gorillas. I mean, these are things that were discovered much later. And you look at the mass and the amount of them, and you go, how did they go unseen for so long? And yet we should have listened to those eyewitnesses that saw them to begin with. They were just taken as consideration of just fearful people in the woods. You guys get back out there and do what you need to do. But they're like, there's like half men running around out there going to kill us, and it's lowland gorillas where they shouldn't be, where people thought there's no way they're there. It's impossible. The temperature, the way, there's just no way. And so I always took that into consideration from zoology with cryptid, in the sense of animals, of why are we always so eager to jump to the conclusion that they don't exist? Why is it this, I always appreciated the scientists that I would speak to that would say, at this time with the data we have, I just don't feel or see how it could exist, but that doesn't mean it doesn't. It's just with the data we have right now, we just don't have enough knowledge of the specimen or the creature to know if it does exist, much like the Brit wolf and, all these different animals along the way, or even the Tasmanian tiger that are being seen again. These are things that if you listen to the locals, they had the stories, they had the eyewitness accounts, they had the personal encounters, but science seemed to overlook that. And I always just was going, how do all these other countries and continents have the same type of specimen in different sizes, height wise, but it's the same specimen in a hole that they're describing.
Mhm.
How can we not acknowledge this anymore? How can we not say that this doesn't exist? How do you say that when we have other places that at the time that these were being written in literature and in books, we didn't have phone calls or TVs to like, hey guys, did you hear in Australia that they saw this thing and what, to make this crazy story across the globe. So it just always baffled me that there were those that always, and of course with the Patterson Gimlin video, it was like, oh, that's a fake, which I always combated because that just seemed like they went so out of their way then to create breasts on this thing and create this whole illusion for what? It wasn't like they didn't get a lot out of it in the respect of that, so that would have been a lot of work and a lot of process for what in the end, so for me, it was like, there's too much to ignore. And so I love the fact that you're like, it is creating a bush. It's creating a family tree of something that people just quickly jump to overlook and not pay attention to those veins that are running closer. And just like we, through our history, learned of our enemies from the past and how we survived and what we did and what we did to the Native Americans and so on and so forth. I almost feel like distinction, like they had the same knowledge of knowing what we did or what may have happened between all these different lineages of beings and how they came to be and where they need to stay hidden because we won't be as kind. You know what I mean? If that makes sense. And so I feel as though they know that, and that's why they're really good at staying hidden and more secluded and where they know they can hide from us and stay off the radar, if that makes sense.
Sure. Yeah, it does. It does, and just to, not to disagree with that, but I don't think personally that you even need to invoke any extraordinary capabilities, because when you consider an animal just like a deer, and when yes, a lot of deer are harvested, but there are a lot of trophy bucks, I meant to say, that survive year after year after year after year. And how is that? Well, and and that doesn't take, they don't have a huge brain. They're not smarter than the average bear, as Yogi would say. But a Sasquatch has greater intelligence, but greater intelligence than an animal like that, more on par with other predators that are out there. But the numbers work in its favor too. This animal almost certainly has a population that's a fraction of the number of deer that are out there, a fraction even of the number of black bear, for example. I use that as an example. One of the most interesting books about black bear in Idaho is called The Shadow of the Forest, because they're so elusive. They've done studies even with radio collared and tracked individuals that will, instead of walking on the road, on the Forest Service road, they stay 10 yards off one way or the other and just follow the grade. But they're in the bush, away from where the cars and pedestrians and cyclists and so forth are going to see them. These natural instinctive behaviors like that, even more than instinctive, but even on an instinctive level, these animals are quite capable, I think, of staying away. But yeah, I was going to interject. I didn't want to interrupt you though, but about the perception. I still have people who come up to me and they're surprised and they'll ask me, "You mean there's more than one?" They have this concept of a single solitary monster that's roaming the earth, and it pops up here and there. Every once in a while, it somehow makes its way over to the Himalayas and shows up in Nepal.
Teleports.
Yeah, literally.
It teleports. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, that's they probably would offer that over a long road trip.
But that's what amazes me, is that unlike all other species which tend to be indigenous, we don't have tigers and elephants in North America.
Right.
And yet a colleague of mine was involved in investigating the Vietnamese Yeti a number of years ago.
Mm-hmm.
The very idea that they are seen, they are, as far as observed, in basically all 5 continents, correct?
Well, more or less, but not to give the impression that they're ubiquitous. There's a very, very tight, biogeographically based distribution, ecologically based, and as I alluded to with the Almasti, which seems to have affinities to a Neanderthal-like thing. They are sited precisely in the most remote corners of the former, at least what we infer as the former distribution of Neanderthals, based on the archaeological and paleontological record. So there's a real good core. It's not like it's a universal archetype. If this was a manifestation of the human psyche, envisioning some figure that was representative of our link to the wilderness, then yeah, you would expect it to pop up wherever there are people. That would be the common factor. But it doesn't work like that. It doesn't work like that. Just like in the United States, unfortunately, the popular media has promoted the notion that Bigfoot is seen in every state in the Union. Well, it may be reported, but it's not seen. And there is not good evidence to support the presence of a large bipedal primate in the wheat fields of Kansas, and so.
Any cases are not investigated. They're reported, but they're not investigated as to whether they are authentic or not.
Well, or they have not produced any corroborative evidence to substantiate some things. And so people do see what they imagine, what they expect. Right. This is one of the differences that Brittany was drawing attention to. Before the proliferation of the internet and cable TV, you could take someone's eyewitness description more at face value. And when you had remarkable convergence in the description of what they saw, someone in British Columbia and someone in Southern Oregon that had no knowledge of one another or never had heard of the word Bigfoot, that's why these historical accounts are really quite interesting, because they predate sort of a community awareness of the topic. And these days, anybody who thinks they see Bigfoot, if pressed for details, could consciously or unconsciously, intentionally or unintentionally, grasp from an imagined
or
profile.
Contaminated. Everyone's been coded. Everyone has an impression of what they've read, what they've seen, and there are no virgin witnesses any longer, so to speak.
Exactly. Yep, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah, everybody's an eyewitness in that regards as of today, because they've seen it on Travel Channel, so now they're pros.
That's right.
I'll just throw that out there. I can say that openly. My question, though, Jeff, it's something that has always baffled me, because so as of late, we've learned that Sasquatch can swim. Right. We've learned this, which I find fascinating. Right. Because for the longest time, which a colleague of all of ours, Ben, he and I have this discussion quite often. And he's like, oh, we could just burn out one area and put them right towards where they're not going to swim. And I'm like, Ben, that's too late. We've already discovered they can swim. He's like, dang it. So it doesn't work anymore. And we argue quite a bit, because he believes in the fact that they're, they have they can time travel. I don't know, go through dimensions or whatever. And we fight on that quite a bit. God love him, but I won't agree with that ever.
Quite a leap to already start questioning origin.
Yeah, no, but my question where I'm heading back to is something that I've always thought about in regards to the history of the land bridge and so on and so forth, and in regards to that region coming over this way. And then the proximity of Russia and Alaska.
Right.
And that connection as well, of how easy it could be. I mean, I know that there is a larger waterway there, but at one point it wasn't as drastic. So my curiosity is, because Russia, it always seems like, oh, there's another Russian There's another, a video coming out of Russia with an incredible footage of what seems like a legitimate Sasquatch. And then Alaska's seem almost identical. So for me, I always feel as though they go hand in hand, as though it was like, well, one time we were able to, and now we're kind of, here we are, but we could still kind of mingle between both if we want. So for me, because of how close it is, I just wonder sometimes if it's come over from that direction. And that's why we have kind of more of a heavy population towards up that way versus other areas in North America.
Well, yeah, several points there. So yes, the continents were contiguous numerous times, and not only just during the Ice Age. And the Ice Age, people have myself included, for the longest time until I really started digging into this, a rather simplistic impression. The glaciers get bigger and the sea levels go down. But
Right.
Glaciation and snow accumulation and so forth wasn't uniform globally. And the correlation of sea level rise and fall then through time was more stochastic. But the point being, clear back not only the Pleistocene, but even into the Pliocene, there were periods of time, and this has been studied. It's just not as the more recent Beringia with all the megafauna, the giant mammoths and mastodons and dire wolves and short-faced bears, and all those things really capture people's imagination, and that's where a lot of the research has been done. And obviously the period coinciding with human colonization of the continent from Asia. But there were times when based on core sampling of sediments in the continental shelf up there under the sea, the Bering Sea, that demonstrate that there were periods when it was, obviously it was dry land, but wasn't a frozen tundra that everyone envisions all the time. There were times when it was even mixed deciduous coniferous forest, like you would find down in Alabama, stretching from central China into all the way to Alabama. In fact, there are discontinuous distribution today of some species of plants and trees, shrubs, that are only found in Asia and in the mostly in the U.S. Southeast, but also up in parts of Canada and so forth as well. But the point being, an animal that inhabits that kind of habitat would see no barrier between Asia and North America. See, it's not like these animals migrated. That term is always misleading. It sort of invokes this idea of packing your bags or your little knapsack and heading off for the horizon, but really it's just a daily distribution. I always used to get into this, just as by way of illustration. I always was rankled and challenged when my colleagues would talk about Homo erectus being the first mobile hominid, because look, we have them from Africa all the way to Southeast Asia. It wasn't until they were longer legged and they had arched feet and they could walk and stride and run that they then pushed out, braved their way out of Africa and made their way all the way over to Southeast Asia. One of my colleagues writing a paleoanthropology text actually titled the chapter on Homo erectus, "The Migrating Hominid." And I called him on the carpet with, I said, look, do the math. When do we first see Homo erectus in Africa? When do we first see them in Southeast Asia? Okay, so you've got, and I won't be able to pull the numbers, but you take the number of millennia that separate those dates, and then what's the distance? They had to go about 20 miles each generation. Mm-hmm. That's not a migration. That's just a population growth and redistribution. As the kids decide that I don't want to live with mom and dad anymore. I'm going to go over the hill and start my own family over there. Where the grass is greener, And
where the grass is greener, or where there's water during a drought, right?
So that's what you have to have in mind when you think about the expansion of whatever it was, Gigantopithecus or a giant Paranthropus or whatever, spreading through East Asia. And then there just happens to be real estate that connects it all the way. They don't know that they're going to a new continent, you know. There was a guy who wrote a book, and now I can't remember which book, whether it was McLeod or Joshua Blue Booze. But he had a paragraph where he said, yeah, these scientists suggest that somehow they came over from Asia. So you've got to envision this paltry band of shuffling apes making their way across this frozen landscape, you know, braving a continent where there were already hungry humans resident. And I'm just thinking, what? You know, talk about political disinformation today. You know, that was the most inane comment that you could make, and gives the totally inaccurate impression of what actually took place. So I think that was it. I mean, yes, they can swim, and yes, they've apparently been able to, and still are able to make it across some of the channels in British Columbia with those many inlets and fjords and islands. But I think swimming across the Bering Strait would be a bit of a stretch. But you never know.
Yeah.
It gets stranded on an iceberg or something.
I just meant how close it was at some point through all the shifting. Some of them kind of got stuck, you know what I mean? And then the numbers just grew here, and we saw the numbers there. Just because of how close it is there. I mean, we know geographically those connected at some point, you know, so it's just, it's fascinating to me. I think
it's almost, I mean, there is no fossil record of higher primates and apes in North America, but there certainly is in Asia. And just like, you know, people don't realize 75% of the mammal species, which we consider native to North America, actually came over from Asia at various times when that, I mean, here's an example, you know, the cute little red panda looks like a little raccoon.
Right.
It's found in Asia, in China, but its fossils have been found in here's those two places again, in Washington State and down, I'm pretty sure it's Alabama. It's one of the southern states. So if a little raccoon-sized creature spread across, I mean, didn't have to brave the Pleistocene tundra of Beringia, but spread across that habitat, why not a large bipedal ape?
And that's a fascinating point. That's something that should be spoke about more often, and it isn't. I wish that there was more, like this conversation alone. We're at the 1 hour, and it sucks because this is a topic that is so fascinating, but these scientific points of record of data that can back the understanding of how something like this could thrive, survive, and come to still exist here is fascing to me. That it's not more talked about. It's always not possible.
Brittany, that fact and many other interesting facts can be found in Sasquatch Legend Meets Science by Dr. Jeff Meldrum.
That's true, which is right here. That's right. You think I don't know?
I know. Well, you said to plug whatever I wanted to plug, so you
Absolutely.
that was an underhand pitch, Brittany.
But Jeff, your
door was open.
Your classic example of what science has essentially sold their souls to, in that they acquire their grants and their special funding by maintaining a party line, juxtaposed to going wherever the evidence leads you. That so many scientists set out with a preconceived theory and they set out to prove it. As far as I'm concerned, there's nothing scientific about that.
Yeah,
here you're dealing with the phenomenon. You're dealing with the phenomenon. You're looking as far as the physical evidence, and until you acquire, you know, the carcass, you capture one alive until you actually have incontrovertible proof. The investigations remain very fluid.
Right.
We go again wherever the chase takes us.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. No, you're right. I do, and I've sometimes have been guilty of chiding my colleagues that, you know, they're pursuing, some of them pursue questions that are already answered. I mean, yes,
Right.
there needs to be more data collected, and that someone needs to do that, but they shouldn't attempt to hobble those who try to kind of push the envelope and push the frontier and do the. I mean, there actually is a category of risky science in the grant categories in say the National Science Foundation. I mean, I can understand the principle, but it seems odd that you would have a separate category for projects that you're not absolutely certain of the outcome already. I mean, that says something, doesn't it? That's not a sad
Yes,
commentary.
it does. Yes, it does.
As we're coming to
go ahead.
As we're coming to the end of the program, and it's one thing that I am also excited about personally is the idea that now drones will be able to cover as far as much deeper into secluded, wooded areas, and especially during the winter months when the trees are pretty denuded, and the idea that even with light amplification and infrared, and even with heat sensory camera equipment, that they should be able to pick up these creatures like never before.
Sure. Yeah, there's unfortunately and I've spent years looking into this and chasing the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, if you will, whatever metaphor you want to use. But we're still up against very limited airtime for multi-copter type of drones. The lighter than air drones are very problematic. It's just not, even if they're tethered, the blimps, it's problematic and limiting. I mean, limiting in one respect, there's all kinds of obstacles with now as regulations because of the abuse of drones in airspace. There's more and more regulations.
There's going to be more regulations than anything, right?
Out here where the habitat is predominantly coniferous forest, we don't have that winter denuding of the canopy, and so penetrance is still a challenge. Now, Brittany and I have been chatting with some folks, and if I can just kind of put out that little teaser, that have access to more cutting edge technologies. And for example, I have communicated with a couple of companies that do LiDAR, the laser imaging, and they're not to the point. I was very open of describing my objective, and they were intrigued, and to say the least, but they acknowledged that they weren't to the point that they could differentiate a large-bodied animal. They said, we're close, though, where that may be practical. So I said, well, please let me know when you think, we can put your logo on the trailer, on the field lab.
Yes. So yeah, exciting times.
Yeah.
That you would admit we're on the brink. Because
sure. I think we're closer and closer. I mean, it's either going to be pursuing. I think those the aerial surveillance methodologies as one alternate, the other being environmental DNA surveying. And we've got to, but the people need to realize environmental DNA isn't the end all. It's just a better canvassing technique to cast the net more broadly. But what the net brings in is very degraded, very fragmentary DNA that is still a real challenge. The challenges we had previously with DNA studies will still be encountered with eDNA. It's just we'll have hopefully more sample to apply those ever improving techniques to. I think those are the two big thrusts. The third one is just going to be dumb luck. A hunter will shoot one, a semi truck will hit one, and it'll be, that'll be the conclusion.
It's only the state of Washington that it's illegal to shoot one, correct?
Well, there are a number of counties here and there who have passed ordinances. Our own here in Bannock County in Idaho has one that was done as a bit of a publicity stunt, admittedly, but it declared Bannock County safe haven for Sasquatch, and so it's illegal to shoot one here. The Skamania County that got all the publicity It was a stunt. I mean, there may have been some members of the council who sincerely were, Bigfoot enthusiasts, but it was a stunt. It was a publicity stunt, and that's, understandable. But it's
Well,
there's still debate.
Let's hope the aerial reconnaissance doesn't drive them deeper into the woods, so to speak.
Well, that's one of the
Right.
disadvantages of the drone, of the multi-copter drone over a blimp is boy, some of them sound like a hornet's nest. They just
Right.
so there's pros and cons.
I think the most effective way is we have to go back to the original explorations, and that's boots on the ground. I mean, I hate to say it, but that's the truth of it, because we can use some of the thermals and the LiDAR, like you were saying, these types of things when we're on the ground, but we have disadvantages from the sky. And like you said, those sounds and things with most animals, they spook, they go, they know, like, nope, I'm gone, I'm out. And I think that maybe we need to take it back to horseback. Like there seems to be a pattern where it is useful. I grew up with elk would come into our front yard and we had horses, we had llamas, and we would put out the salt blocks and watch the giant herds just come in, big males. And I would sit maybe 10, 15 away from them because they were so used to us at that point. Right. But because there were so many other animals on our property, it was very much like I think for them, it was like a sanctuary. They weren't frightened. We weren't going to shoot them. We weren't, and they became familiar with that. And so I feel like sometimes we get too caught up in the tech when we have the basics in the science. Let the science do their part when we bring the collective data, but the field work, like we're doing. And I made a point of this recently on my social media, was the fact that I've noticed a repeat and I'll try and say this quickly because I know we've ran over time, but a repeat when people find nesting. And I want to bring you back on the show, Jeff, because there are questions I have in regards to how you take from the nests and the structures and everything out. And I think we need to do that. I think we should have another episode where we discuss that even further, because I know you were part of the, or you were brought in on the team that also found 20 nests, and so I've seen videos and pictures of people that are like, this could be an alleged nest, and they're laying in it. They're cross-contaminating it in so many ways. And they're like, we're going to collect samples. And I'm like, why? Don't waste your time. You guys literally just put your DNA all over that puppy, so it's going to be a wash when it goes through the reader. And so, I put a post out, like, if you find a nest or something that is tangible like that, that is really amazing for us, don't touch it. Try not to even cough in that direction. Hold your breath, get cloth gloves, collect data as if it's a crime scene, because your fingerprints don't need to be on it. We have to collect the data because that's just that's important.
That's a term that needs to be used, that it's you're essentially cordoning off a crime scene minus a crime.
Yep.
Exactly.
Whether it's archaeologists, that if it's an active site, you keep the amateurs away, because
they
or train them. I mean, we need a generation of citizen scientists that are more aware, and that's something that I've kind of taken on as a professional goal for this year, is and the coming, for the future, is to try to work towards disseminating more training materials, building upon my field guide. Another plug there.
There it is. Which I'm going to get to. I'll let you finish your closing. Yeah.
It's a great start, but yeah, that's really, really, really important. Even just putting a scale in a photograph of an alleged footprint is a very important element to standardize and create more reliable and useful data, so that we can add that to the coffer with confidence.
And another takeaway.
Whether you're talking about an archaeological dig or geologists or anthropologists, they all rely on volunteers.
Right.
They all rely on students who have been briefed and thoroughly educated as to how to handle samples, how to bag and tag as far as any possible artifacts, that type of thing, without treating it like a souvenir, without acting as though that this is any form, of entertainment. And unfortunately, whenever we deal with television, they're looking for what looks good on camera first.
Yeah.
And science often
And
takes the back.
And I was just going to go there, Don. I'm glad you said it, because coming from both sides, behind the screen and on screen, the biggest problem I have is that people truly interested in the field, but don't know a lot in the field, but do their own side research, reading books and so on and so forth. They watch these shows and they want to duplicate what they see these experts do on TV. But in some cases, some are not experts. They've been just chosen out of a select picking to be in this project.
Often actors, yeah.
Right. And so over the years, we've seen this unfold. And I've had many conversations where I've had people say, oh, well, I do this when I'm out. And I'm like, no. But I saw this on this show. That's what they did. And I go, no. You know, I have learned, and even from my own field work and then talking with Meldrum with his field guide, like that's a no, you know? So like immediately it's like, they want to replicate what they see on TV because they think they're the experts. I have to do what they do. But they, in some cases, and I hate to be so bold, but they're actually anti what they're researching, you know, on TV. They're not actually staying to the facts and staying to the truth of the proof that we do have. I get very annoyed when on TV they'll say, we have no data to prove it even exists. And I go, excuse me, and what? What? Like, we have vials of hair samples that everybody just ignores. We have foot casts, handprints, DNA. I mean, what are you talking about? We have it. It's just science doesn't recognize it yet. Don't say that on TV because you're telling the wrong message. So I get very heated because that does not help the next generation. And Don, like you and I, when we talk about the generation of ufology, of studying just the eye of understanding what is something abnormal in the sky versus normal in the sky, we have to help guide that. And I have a deep passion for Sasquatch, and growing up in the Rockies, I had an account with my mother. And so it has resonated with me that even for my kids, I want them to have a better understanding to keep that research going and growing in the right way, to where they look at it like an exploration of an adventure, of a discovery of a lifetime, and not, I could get my arms ripped off in the middle of the woods because this thing is a monster. You know, I can't take it. I can't take it. And it goes on the same token of UFO. It's like this intergalactical being is coming with 25 others within asteroids, and they're going to take over the earth. And it's like, oh my God, where are you getting this information from? You know, but that's what they're feeding to the next gen. And it's sad for me because I believe we'd have more people taking this serious, and more people in the generations in the 20s and in some teenagers that would take it more serious as a real field work, if it was properly taught to them in the right way, like a true class, a real session of understanding of history of it for that matter. And I think if that was more present and not so much what you see on TV, I think we'd have more of a natural interest, and not a bunch of hoaxers wanting to be the next guy to get their video on Paranormal Caught on Camera, if that makes sense. And that upsets me because we fight against that in all these fields, in ufology and cryptozoology, and even the term cryptozoology almost gets cringed at. But I have to remind people, all it is just animals that are not recognized by science or thought to have been extinct. That's all it is. It's no monsters. It's just, what animal is this? Do we have a giant fruit bat in New Jersey that's being misidentified and called the Jersey Devil? Yes, most likely that's the case. Or a fox bat. So, you know, it's like, just put more of a natural mindset on this and not so crazy. And I think you would be able to level the plane a little bit and get more people seriously involved. Plus, the viewers are completely underestimated by their intelligence half the time as well.
Right.
Just my rant on the matter, because it is a very heated debate of mine that I feel very passionate about. These are two very passionate projects of mine, and I get very annoyed when they're presented almost inaccurately away from the true science or the true research and the true work that has been done over the years, from the 40s on ufology to, you know, the 60s with Patterson Gimlin. It's just, it baffles me. Or the first, you know, cast of Bigfoot that was taken, and where it coined the term Bigfoot, you know, at the logging area. So it just, baffles the mind that half the time people don't even know that. They think Bigfoot just came about after Robinson Gimlin, or Patterson Gimlin video.
We need to do a part 2 and
Yes.
get into
Sure.
the cases and the best cases beyond, and even going back to, I've always been fascinated with the Teddy Roosevelt encounter.
Yes.
And as far as from a former president, that I'm sure that left quite an impact at the time. And given that it was a rather violent encounter, correct?
Well, that wasn't his personal encounter. It was a story related to him, which has regional significance for me because it allegedly took place here in the Bitterroot Mountains on the border between Idaho and Montana.
Yes,
but
yes,
you're right.
yes.
One of those few instances where Bigfoot was aggressive, but obviously in retaliation. The trappers were the protagonists, I guess you'd say, or the antagonists. Fired the first shots and probably.
Well, we'll get into that. We'll get into that next time.
Yeah.
Among any other, but.
Yeah, because I could literally keep talking about this for the next 2.5 hours. I would just say, sorry, kids, you're with your dad. I've got work. I've got stuff to do. I'm not turning this off. We're staying all night. But because we are at the end, as Don mentioned, yes, we've gone way over, and I apologize to the viewers. This is just an incredible topic, and to have both worlds collide, it's phenomenal. And I know, Jeff, you're very busy. And I know that Don and I both extremely appreciate you coming on the show. And since we are at the end of it, I would love for you to let the viewers, or the listeners, excuse me, know where they can see you, hear you, or look you up, or to contact you if they have any questions, or if they have an alleged sighting that they would like to share with you.
Sure. Well, I don't have a personal web page per se, but other than my academic web page, but certainly open to emails, and that's simply at meld@isu.edu. For books and so forth, my field guides and so forth, I would direct people to the publisher's webpage, which is Paradise K Publishers, and it's Para-K with a C, so PARACAY.com. And you can find Sasquatch Legend Meets Science, which is by far, I'll unabashedly say, the best primer, I think, to get the reader going. It's still, even though it's now, 20 years old, it's still a great, timely treatment of the subject to get you started. Not only my opinions, but the beauty of that documentary that inspired it. It had contributions from many experts. So it literally is Sasquatch Legend meets scientists, plural. But also, as we mentioned, my field guides and other publications, in the vein of what you were talking about, Brittany. Over the last summer, I wrote a series of little activity workbooks for young readers, ages 8 and older. I hooked up with a fantastic artist who we just had a real simpatico, and he could crank out beautiful artwork of my concepts. So I would compose and cut and paste and draft, very roughly all the verbiage and everything, the text, and turn the manuscript over to him, and he would generate these beautiful books. They were so fun that after we did the Sasquatch edition, there was quickly a Yeti, and then an Almasti, and then a Orangutan, and I even tackled the Yowie. But it's full of, full of historical aspects. It has geography. I mean, I learned about geography reading Ivan Sanderson's Abominable Snowman Legend Come to Life, where he went into great detail of all these mountain ranges and forests and so on, the biogeography. It has all sorts of activities, word searches, puzzles, mazes that engage the young reader and get them thinking. It has blank pages where they can draw their own with their imagination what an encounter might be like, and stickers even. So it's great. It was great fun to do, and the reception has been very positive.
Wonderful. So I take it Sanderson was also an influence growing up.
Ivan Sanderson's book was the first Christmas where I asked for a book instead of, another BB gun or something. And so, I devoured that book over and over again. It's my copy is very.
And then, as far as my field, Sanderson's book Uninvited Visitors was one of the first I ever read.
Yes.
I read that one too. Yeah.
His literature and his work, I think it truly was fascinating. I just loved it.
It had a lot of impact. Certainly did.
Mm-hmm.
He
never, unfortunately, never got the respect.
No. Especially at the time that the government regarding UFOs was actively involved, and anyone who said anything contrary to their official position was smeared, was character assassinated.
Mm-hmm.
He had a chopping block, unfortunately.
When his book, When a Bomb with Snowman Legend come to life, came out in '62, that was right at the high point of the sort of the party line in anthropology, was what was called the single species hypothesis. That was that there could be only one hominin on the planet at a time, because the niche was so particular, the old one species, one niche dogma of ecology, and anthropology glommed onto that. And so they saw human evolution as this single file march. So when he suggests there were subhuman species on 5 continents, it was a subtitle. It was like, right. No, it can't exist. Of course it's. So the reviews of his book were just terrible.
I'm sure.
Yeah. But I did love it because, again, we could talk about this for hours, but he thought out of the box. You got to give it to him. I mean, truly thought out of the box. And I love that and appreciated that mostly in his work, because I've always admired people that could step away from what we've been taught and create their own ideas and theories from those, and think outside of the norm and the box, and be able to actually theorize something that can easily be explained with fact. And I love that. I love that.
Sure.
I mean, he was a true pioneer in the sense that he maybe didn't find, the land across the ocean, but nonetheless, he wasn't afraid to get on the ship, so to speak.
Yeah. God, that's the truth. Well, on that note, that's a great way to end this. And I think that we need to get you back on. Obviously, I do know this topic could be discussed again for hours and hours, but like I said, there were a lot of things, and as Don mentioned, Roosevelt, and several things on the other side of the coin too, as far as structures and nests and other literature from the times that people don't realize how far back Sasquatch has been written about and spoke about, and especially by leading figures. So that is something that I would love.
Native Americans, for example, have a long history of actually dealing with, as though they even had some form of relationship at times, or so they would create the impression.
Exactly. And I mean, there's a heavy debate with Leif Erikson in some of his literature that he wrote in regards to, the very tall, hairy, type of men that he encountered, and how he described them over years. People have taken that and basically explained that's his impression of Sasquatch. Like anything that would tower him and his men and had such a rank odor, and the eyes were so black in color, must have been Sasquatch, so it's fascinating. That's another thing I would love to talk in depth, because that's a heavy debate. There's a lot of people that go back and forth saying that's just not what it is. And then there's others that go, that is what it is. It's saying right in his literature, he's talking about Sasquatch. So it's, that's definitely something to talk about. But like I said, we could definitely talk about this for another 2 hours, and I don't want to have to put our producer through that. But we will have you back on, Jeff, because again, this is, for me personally, like I said in the beginning of this episode, this is like, I could, die and be a happy woman for the rest of my life, because I've had two of my leading work and field work and love and passion just exploded tonight in one room of having two things that I've been fascinated with since a young kid. And so to have my mentors both here together with me discussing and having fantastic conversation on both sides of the coin has been truly wonderful. And having you on tonight with us and discussing everything has been great fun for all of us. And I know Don would agree. So you're welcome back anytime, Jeff. Thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to come on the show tonight. We really, really appreciate it.
Happy to do it and love to come back.
Wonderful. And for me, it was enlightening. And whenever one can go to the authority and especially exchange notes of the very methodology that not only applies in your field, but in all fields of endeavor, that we shouldn't expect answers overnight. We shouldn't expect every, as far as day to provide breakthroughs, as much as half the excitement, half the adventure is the chase. Yeah. Whether it takes a lifetime or just a matter of years, I want to be at the finish line. And I'm sure you do too, Jeff. You just want to be at the finish line when it's over.
Sure, I would love to, yes.
So again, thank you listeners for coming on tonight and listening to an episode of which I have longed for, and I'm grateful we were able to get Jeff on the show tonight to discuss this. I know Don, you probably enjoyed it as much as I did, obviously, because it's a fascinating topic and definitely something that's been around for a while. What was that? It was a little broke up.
Oh, I said 100%. I too could have gone for hours more, because it's a topic that you can't explore elements of the unknown without respecting those that, albeit they may be pursuing a different phenomenon, nonetheless, we are all kindred spirits. We're all brothers and sisters in the sense that we're chasing elusive phantoms. And as a result, we share in the skepticism, we share in the criticism, and we can talk to one another. We can exchange notes. We can share stories, and we can empathize. And that was the wonderful thing about him, because he's walked the walk. And I love anyone who honestly is in the field, taking all the slings and arrows, so to speak.
Absolutely. Yep. And we know that in that type of field work, we know that he does. I mean, I'm sure it happens more than he would probably like. But for those listeners, again, thank you so much for listening to this episode. We're sorry that it went a little longer, but again, this topic is fascinating to all of us, and we hope that you listened all the way through. And if you did, you can come visit us on our official website at anchor.fm/no earthly explanation. If you have any questions or anything regarding even this episode you'd like to share, possibly an experience, you can send us an email at noearthlyexplanation@gmail.com. You can find us and listen to us anywhere you'd like, especially on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Anchor, Amazon Music, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Breaker, Podcast, Public Radio. My God, the list goes on and on. Anywhere you want to hear, we're there. You can feel free to follow us on Facebook or on Instagram, all under No Earthly Explanation as the handle. Your hosts, myself and Don, are also on Facebook and Instagram. You can find me at Brit Barbieri official on Facebook, and on Instagram you will find me at Brit_investigates. Donald Schmidt you can find on Instagram at Don47Tom, or on Facebook at /Donald Raymond Schmidt with an A. And again, thank you so much for listening in, and we look forward to talking and hearing more stories of the things that go bump in the night. Don, I know you're going to go get in your DeLorean and take off. So until next time.
There's park, so I'm headed back to Venus yet tonight. So hope to be back for the next show.
Tell the Venetians I say hello. I plan to go to Scotland to go look for Nessie. So I'll see you next time.
So, goodbye.
Goodbye, Don.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. Please be sure to rate and review this episode. This podcast is produced by Todd Fisher and distributed by Metacortex Publishing. This podcast is copyright. Any previously trademarked or copyright content is used by permission. Information and opinions stated in this podcast should not be construed as medical advice. Please be sure to visit the official website for the International Association of Metatomics at metatomics.org, or find us on social media for other unique content.